Welcome to WTF, the rise of the Tech Broligarchy. I'm Ramsha Sajid, coming to you live on Zoom and streaming across social media.
And I'm Jay Dulani. And if you're wondering why we're starting a series with WTF, well, that was literally our reaction last month watching tech billionaires line up at Trump's inauguration like they were at a Silicon Valley product launch.
That's right. Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, the mask is finally coming off as they openly embrace MAGA.
Talk about it. While they have spent years positioning themselves as champions of innovation and progress, these tech bros have actually been building towards this moment for years by accumulating more wealth than any group of individuals in human history.
I mean, just look at these numbers. It's almost hard to make sense of the amount of wealth we're talking about. The top 20 billionaires in the United States account for $2.7 trillion in wealth. Tech billionaires make up 70% of 70% of that wealth. How much money is that?
I mean, enough to pay off some student loans, medical debt, probably enough to solve the unhoused crisis in the US.
And that's why we're calling this series The Rise of the Tech Broligarchy. Because what we're dealing with isn't just regular old wealth inequality. It's a new form of oligarchy run by a very specific breed of tech billionaire who thinks they should control not just the digital world, but the actual government too. Over the course of this political education series, you'll learn who is the tech broligarchy and what do they want? How are they partnering with this administration in real time to advance their agenda? And what are the crises that we need to be paying attention to?
Right. And today we're going to start with the basics. Over this next hour, we're going to break down what exactly is an oligarchy and how can we be sure we have one right now. We'll reveal the 14 names behind the tech broligarchy beyond just the usual suspects. We'll discuss how they used their wealth to help put Trump back in power. And most importantly, what can we do about it?
Whether you're watching on Zoom or following us on social media, comment on where you're watching from and what made you tune in today.
Before we jump in to today's oligarchy, let's get clear on what that word actually means.
Yeah, because the word oligarchy has been thrown around a lot in the last couple of weeks, but what exactly are we talking about?
At its most basic, an oligarchy is ruled by a few over the many. It is really powerful people who are also really wealthy. But what sets them apart from just rich people is that they use their wealth as a form of political power.
And Dulani, what's the aim of oligarchs? In other words, why do they use their wealth to exert political power?
Yeah, this is so important because it helps to further distinguish oligarchies from, say, rich people with special interests. It's no secret money influences politics, whether we're talking about lobbyists, campaign contributions, special interest groups. That all might be undemocratic, but it's not necessarily an oligarchy. An oligarchy is different in that their primary motivation is to guard their wealth. A good example historically is the robber barons of the 1800s. The Rockefellers, Carnegies, Vanderbilts, they controlled railroads, oil, and steel. This was all crucial infrastructure at the time of the Industrial Revolution. And they used their wealth to exert power in a way that allowed them to protect their wealth and accumulate more wealth.
So today, instead of railroads and oil, these oligarchs control our data, our attention, and our digital infrastructure.
Exactly. And remember, oligarchy is the rule of few over the many, and this modern day broligarchy has a small number of names, 14 in total to be exact. To those watching, throw down a comment. Who do you think is in the broligarchy? Let's see if you can get a few. Let's start with the usual suspects. These three that you see on your screen, Musk, Zuckerberg, and Bezos, are the ones that we've probably seen and heard from the most. Here are some interesting common threads among these three. Their combined net worth is over $800 billion. Dollars. All three are heavily invested in building artificial intelligence and data centers to generate money, and they all generate money from advertising online. Two of them own their own social media platforms, Elon Musk with X, Zuck with Facebook, and Bezos isn't far behind. He owns the Washington Post. Two of them have their own aerospace company, Musk with SpaceX and Bezos with Blue Origin.
And here's how they amass political and economic power. Elon Musk was the biggest contributor to Trump's campaign last year. He donated over 290 million and founded a large pro-Trump super PAC that raised over 260 million in 2024 alone. Musk was also tapped by Trump to run the Department of Government Efficiency, which is basically trying to gut the federal government and lay off workers. We'll talk more about that in our next webinar. Both Bezos and Zuckerberg gave $1 million to Trump's inauguration fund. Bezos has made his money from e-commerce through Amazon.com and cloud computing through Amazon Web Services, which charges businesses, companies, and organizations to host their websites. Netflix, for example, uses AWS. Zuckerberg made his money from digital advertising on Facebook and Instagram. He's also heavily invested in virtual reality and artificial intelligence.
Right. Now let's share some names you might also be familiar with, but let's call them the basic broligarchy. They're less visible as people, but their companies are not. Here are some common threads about these basic bros. Most of them donated $1 million each to Trump's inauguration fund, all except for Ellison, but he's donated to Republicans like Tim Scott and Marco Rubio. The companies they own are ones we likely interact with every day, from OpenAI with Sam Altman, which created ChatGPT, Apple and Tim Cook, Google and Sundar Pichai, Microsoft with Satya Nadella, and Oracle with Larry Ellison. All of these dudes are investing in artificial intelligence and building data centers. We'll talk more about that in a couple webinars.
Okay, let's go a layer deeper into the Broligarchy to a group we call the investors. Here are some common themes about them. All of these men run venture capital firms. They are the money behind the tech of the Broligarchy. They are not only big campaign contributors, they've hosted fundraisers for Trump, and many of them are actively taking on roles inside the Trump administration or helping staff this new administration. JD Vance, the vice president, has direct ties to most of these names since he made his money working for a venture capital firm run by Peter Thiel.
And here's some more unique things about these investors. First, Peter Thiel, David Sachs, and Joe Lonsdale were the money behind a company named Palantir. Some of you might know of Palantir through the work of Mahente and their No Tech for ICE campaign, because Palantir provides a platform that allows cops and immigration officials to process large quantities of data for surveillance. David Sachs was recently named AI and crypto czar by Trump. It's a role where he'll get to advise on AI and crypto policy without having to get approval from the Senate, similar to Elon Musk and his role with DOGE. Masayoshi Son is a name you should remember too. He runs SoftBank, which is a huge venture capital firm. Most notably, SoftBank, alongside fellow Broligarchs Larry Ellison and Sam Altman, announced the construction of a $500 billion data center in Texas called Stargate, which we will talk about in a future webinar. Lastly, Mark Andreessen is an important figure in the Broligarchy. He founded Netscape, and for those of us around the 90s, we remember Netscape as one of the first major web browsers. For the last couple of decades, Andreessen has been investing in tech firms. He used to be a donor to the Democratic Party until Trump, and he's the most visible face right now of Silicon Valley's migration towards the right.
Okay, we've got one more name left in the Broligarchy, the military bro. So don't let the mullet and the terrible goatee fool you. Palmer Luckey represents the way of the Broligarchy is making a lot of money using our taxpayer money. The company Luckey owns, Anduril, is a major developer of drones for the Department of Defense. In fact, last week they announced they're building a $900 million drone and missile factory in Ohio. Plenty of tax breaks, state and federal grants are subsidizing the construction of that factory. And no surprise here, but Luckey supported Donald Trump since 2016 and donated to a Trump super PAC in 2024.
So we just went through the 14 names behind the tech broligarchy. Before moving on, here's some things we didn't mention. Governments are a significant customer for the kinds of technology these tech bros make. We're talking defense technology, financial technology, aerospace, cloud computing, just to name a few. Remember, we said that an oligarchy uses their wealth to flex political power. Beyond campaign contributions, one notable thing is that many of these tech bros have their own philanthropic organizations where they give out millions of dollars to think tanks, law firms, other nonprofits that align with their business interests. Lastly, many of these tech bros were under investigation or being sued by federal agencies like the Federal Trade Commission or Department of Justice. And now many of those proceedings are shutting down under Trump. So, again, the primary motivation of an oligarchy is to preserve their own wealth. And this tech broligarchy has been able to do that. So, for those watching, drop some comments on something that really surprised you about the broligarchy.
All right, so now we're going to dig deeper into oligarchies and see what that teaches us about oligarchy and what we're dealing with today. Joining us for this discussion is MediaJustice's Executive Director, Stephen Renderos.
Hey, hey, what's up, y'all? Good to be here.
Good
Hey,
to have.
Stephen. I think we just need a spotlight on Stephen.
Oh, you're just hearing the voice of like some deity out there, and you can't see me. Can y'all see me now?
Not
Not
on
yet.
my end.
Okay, I saw a thumbs up coming in somewhere, so I must be coming in for some people somewhere.
Oh, yeah. Some people, the chat says they can see you. So,
Okay, that's what matters. It's as long as the chat sees me, that's what's
Okay.
up.
Okay, cool. Well, then let's dive in. Stephen, you have some familiarity with oligarchies since your family is from El Salvador. We just looked at 14 people who make up the Tech Broligarchy, and coincidentally, Salvador's oligarchy consisted of 14 families. Can you tell us more about them and what the source of their power was?
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting. El Salvador has this like history and a strong reputation of like we actually used to call them Las Catorce or the 14 families, and that's what was kind of the shorthand to refer to a set of families that basically shaped and controlled the vast majority of life inside of El Salvador. And my parents actually grew up in an area of the country that was very rural, and there was a lot of like coffee growing. It was a coffee growing region, and in that particular place, these handful of families actually owned the vast majority of the land. So like there was very limited land that individuals could own, that individuals could use to farm their own stuff. Like most of the land was owned by these 14 families. So just imagine that, like 80% of like the land around you is owned by somebody else. Most of the time, people you haven't ever met. And the power of this particular oligarchy, it came from coffee. It's why, like, if you search for this online, if you dig up like history books on El Salvador, they'll often refer to it as a coffee oligarchy. And then, Salvador is interesting. We have a Napoleon complex about ourselves. Like we're mighty small, but we're also the largest coffee producer in Central America. And this wasn't always the case. This actually happened as a big result of like the oligarchy itself, um, which got its start like really in the late 1800s when the government, a kind of newly formed government in the aftermath of like colonialism, essentially handed over communal lands that had been farmed by indigenous people for generations. And up until that point, El Salvador was the land was a very rich, kind of diverse place. The ecosystem was very self-sustaining. It produced a variety of different kinds of crops. What the oligarchy did is they came in and they
Had been
captured the
farmed.
land in order to focus it around coffee producing. Um, and what's interesting in addition, I think with this particular oligarchy is that it's not like that oligarchy was unique to Central America. You actually had a parallel version of it happening everywhere else in Central America. What a lot of people refer to as like the Banana Republic, where you had American companies like United Fruit that dominated local economies, that shaped the politics, that shaped the norms of that society. It just happened to be a foreign company that was doing that. in El Salvador, it was homegrown, and it was a similar kind of a common set of families. And they got rich from coffee. They then leveraged that wealth to diversify into other industries like banking, and diversified also eventually into purchasing media. And the key thing to understand, I think, about this particular concentration of economic wealth, it's that it shaped the entire society. It took a country that had the ability to feed its own people and transformed the land to be something that's functioned in service of imperialism, where like its primary purpose was to produce coffee for an ever-growing larger demand globally, particularly in places like the United States and Europe. And so it took a country that could feed itself and made it dependent on other people, on imperialism in order to sustain. And this sort of an arrangement of like the country essentially positioning itself to only really produce coffee and shaping its entire economy around coffee, that was the norm and the arrangement for decades. And this is what allowed the oligarchy to maintain its wealth over so many decades. And they often, at many times, use the military in very specific ways to do so.
That's really interesting. Can you share more specifically about La Matanza and what was the oligarchy's role in it?
Yeah, I mean, I think as I was saying, like an oligarchy, this particular oligarchy was not immune to using like the El Salvador's military as a vehicle to like do what you all were talking about earlier, which is like, the function of an oligarchy, it's to protect its own wealth. And so La Matanza, which translates to the massacre, it's one of these historical events in El Salvador that people rarely talk about. And in fact, like it's only been until recent years that from in a very intentional way, has there been any real acknowledgement that this historical event happened. And this was like 1932, just to take you to the time period. It's the period of the Great Depression. One of the consequences of like reshaping your entire economy around a single thing, in this case, coffee, is that when things collapse like that deals that and when you have economic collapse like you did during the Great Depression, um, that has a cascading effect. And it certainly did so in El Salvador. And you had, farm workers who were getting paid nothing to cultivate and work the land. And so, as those kinds of conditions typically tend to, foster throughout history, those are the conditions for when people are demanding change. And so there were, farm worker-led organizing struggles that were emerging in the early 1900s in El Salvador, of farm workers demanding better pay, access to land, the ability to cultivate, different crops. Um, and you also had like an emerging like socialist and communist like consciousness within El Salvador, as was happening throughout the world. And this moment was the moment that the oligarchy chose to really tamp that down. Um, Among many of the people that were organizing were a large swath of like El Salvador's indigenous population. And so the oligarchy got the military under, this General Maximiliano Hernandez Martinez, um, to unleash like systematic slaughter. And so what happened is like literally in a very short period of time, like within weeks, like the paramilitary groups organized, by landowners, by this oligarchy, killed about 30,000 people. And that's a big number. And also, I think I want to put it into context because it's an even bigger number when you consider that in El Salvador at that time, that was 4% of its entire population. So
Wow.
think about that in the US, like we're talking 13, 14 million people that one day existed and another day didn't. Among those, like, that 4% were most of its indigenous population. Um, and what happened is like it set in motion, I think, and set culturally in El Salvador, this period in which people didn't talk about that. Like in one fell swoop, like its indigenous population was wiped out. Those that did remain suppressed their indigenous identity. Those cultural traditions went away. It wasn't something that was talked about in any significant way, in large part because the oligarchy had also started purchasing like media institutions. So it was completely, wiped out from the conversation. And that's a big reason why like it's only been several decades later that we can even start to acknowledge like this level of violence that occurred in this period. But it was very much driven by the oligarchy.
Hmm. Yeah, it's really really important and really amazing and intense to hear about this history and some of the parallels. And it's really good to hear you talk about the organizing because I was wondering, what we can learn in terms of how was this oligarchy challenged and what's the status today, particularly as El Salvador is ruled by a populist authoritarian, not too different from Trump, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he goes by many nicknames, all self-imposed. This the president Nayib Bukele. He calls himself the Twitter president. He calls himself the world's coolest dictator. So yeah, I mean, he's a populist authoritarian, much in the same way that I think Trump is, and I think yeah, he's a strong man in the kind of very Latin American sort of way. Um, yeah, I mean, I think an interesting point. I think even though I'm saying like in the public discussion, La Matanza wasn't necessarily a part of the conversation or the culture. It's not to say that resistance didn't happen throughout that time period. And I think that is like it's a very critical thing, I think, to lift up that even in the harshest of conditions, there is there is organizing and there is resistance that is happening, even in this moment that we're living through with the tech oligarchy emerging, with fascism ascending, with authoritarianism taking root inside of the White House, there's still resistance that is actually taking place in many different layers of society, and I think that's really critical. Um, there was several breaks I think over since La Matanza in 1932, um, where where resistance like really manifested into real change. The first real kind of crack in in the kind of society in El Salvador was in 1944 when that general that I mentioned that was like a key architect of La Matanza was finally forced out of power, and that happened through a general strike. From the 1960s through the 1970s, this was a period of like the new left, a period of liberation theology and in Catholicism, which El Salvador is a very Catholic country, but that kind of spirit of like of humanism and revolution was kind of in the air. And they played a very critical role in continuing to agitate against authoritarian regimes, many of them like military regimes. By the 1970s, there were like multiple different progressive and revolutionary formations that had formed that were all like organized around trying to challenge like the economic and social and political power of the oligarchy. This was also a period where someone who was recently a few years ago named a saint by the Catholic Church, Oscar Romero, who was the Archbishop of El Salvador. One of the things he's most famous for is having produced this kind of weekly radio show where his homilies, his kind of lecture, would be in part like the kind of typical Catholic lecture you would expect to hear when you sitting in the pews at a church, but then in part was like a news show where he would sit and like detail like the histories and examples and news stories of atrocities that were happening to everyday people. And like he would collect those stories from people who would show up at the church in San Salvador and say, you have to talk about this thing that the other media sources are not going to talk about. So those were kind of the kinds of challenges. Like what all that led to was an explosion of civil war that lasted from about 1980 to 1992. The Revolutionary Party that was formed, the FMLN, which was named after Faribundo Martí, who was one of the organizers, farm worker organizers that was killed in 1932 in La Matanza. This Revolutionary Party formed kind of in his name and fought against the Salvadorian government and in large part against the oligarchy. It's in part how my family made it to the United States. A lot of the fighting took place in some of those lands that were owned by the oligarchs in those coffee growing regions, and pushed like my family out of those places because of the violence got too intense. But there was resistance throughout. And so when you think about, we get to the end of the Civil War, it didn't really result in any kind of decisive victory one way or the other. You had peace accords that were negotiated very heavily by the United States. The United States intervened in many significant ways. The peace accords like held by the United Nations, that led to like truth and reconciliation commissions and everything else. Like what it led to was establishing like the Revolutionary Party as a political party and installing kind of some form of democracy. But it was a democracy that's not too different from the US, like a two-party system, a more kind of progressive one and a more right-wing one. And yeah, like Bukele emerges like out of the failure of that democracy. And he's complicated because he presents himself as like this outsider who fights like corrupt elites, whose popularity is really high, and it's actually yeah, it's interesting to see his appeal in El Salvador among people that I know, but in a very typical like populist fashion. He's concentrated a tremendous amount of like personal power by attacking democratic institutions, which should sound familiar. He went after the courts, he went after different agencies of government, he went after Congress, like his own Congress. He went after different like democratic institutions and like weakened them essentially. And we're seeing that playbook, play out here in the US. And so yeah, I mean, I think there's many parallels between Nayib Bukele and Donald Trump, but they both are really good at exploiting genuine grievances that people have about systems while offering like what are basically authoritarian solutions that don't address any of the underlying concentration of wealth and power. The oligarchy in El Salvador since the Civil War might have gotten more spread out, more diffused. Wealth might have gotten transferred in different places, but it's still a country where the wealth is still concentrated among a few. And in the United States, I think we're living through something very similar.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I appreciate you bringing up the parallels because that's what was standing out to me. There's like this extraction from the land. You also mentioned like the control of information via newspapers and television. Can you talk more about how that compares to what we're seeing today?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean the comparisons are obvious, right? In many ways, like in Salvador, an oligarchy controlled major newspapers, later television stations, many radio stations. In fact, I think like one of the counterweights at that time during the Civil War, this is a bit of a tangent, but like was a guerrilla radio that was produced by the FMLN, Radio Venceremos. And the way they propped it up was they through solidarity networks in the US, like this radio transmitter from Minnesota, which I have like a history. I went to school out there, which is kind of like, I don't know, maybe a Salvadorian finding a home in Minnesota. It felt at home for some reason. And I think this is part of it. It's like the radio transmitter, which was literally called the Viking transmitter, made its way down, like got snuck into El Salvador, and the Revolutionary Party like would produce a guerrilla radio show, and it was necessary because it became an antidote, like an alternative to essentially like streams of propaganda that were really suppressing the public conversation. And so, that's what it looked like in El Salvador at that time. The oligarchs owned the newspapers, they owned the television stations, they got to dictate like the national narrative. And today's like tech oligarchs, they control this in kind of in similar but also more sophisticated ways. You know, Elon Musk owns Twitter slash X. Zuckerberg controls Facebook and Instagram, which are, you know, pretty huge social media platforms. Most people nowadays are getting their information from, you know, from platforms that have some level of manipulation going on, some level of algorithmic like determination. Like it's not like you're opening up the newspaper and picking the story you want to read. Things are being picked for you through a machine that you have no relationship to. Um, and that's like, you know, I think those are the similarities, but I think where there's a critical difference is how they exercise this control. The Salvadorian media monopoly was like straightforward propaganda. And I think the version of that propaganda today, what is slightly unique is that it has the like appearance of openness, the appearance that like multiple people are getting to shape the story, because social media is this tool where you get to like post things and you get to like, you know, have your like clickbait tweets and stuff that you put out, right? Like it gives you this illusion that you can control the narrative when in fact like there are algorithms that manipulate what's the content that gets pushed and what doesn't. And I think so. The other parallel I would draw to this is just like the way that it creates echo chambers. You know, the oligarchy controlled media in El Salvador, they got to paint a picture of the country in a way that allowed the wealthy to sustain their wealth. And it's happening here in the United States with this tech broligarchy as well. And I think a really good example of this recently is this like biotech billionaire who owns the LA Times. The Los Angeles Times, which is my hometown newspaper, he um he made a choice leading up to the elections to not allow the newspaper to publish an endorsement for one of the presidential candidates. The Washington Post actually did this. Guess who owns the Washington Post? Yeah, we've mentioned it, you know, Jeff Bezos. They made choices not to allow those newspapers to post those endorsements. At the same time, now, like a couple months later, as Trump is trying to get some of his like worst like nominees through Senate confirmation, the LA Times published this op-ed basically in favor of like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. for like the head of like the Health and Human Services, you know, a known like conspiracy theorist, like anti-vaxxer, running like this agency that's going to have responsibility over the next pandemic. That's wild. And you know, like they posted this op-ed that was in favor of Robert F. Kennedy. The trippy part is the guy who wrote the op-ed did not write an op-ed in favor of Robert F. Kennedy. Like the LA Times manipulated his content in order to make it seem like he was endorsing him, when in fact he wasn't. And as soon as they published the op-ed, the LA Times owner, Patrick Sheen Soon, I think is his name. He's like a South African. But he's a biotech billionaire. That's the reason I'm bringing him up, because he is not necessarily a part of the Broligarchy, but made his money through tech. He was tweeting it out and pushing that story that like, yes, like Robert F. Kennedy is the right candidate for this job. So there is this way, I think, in which oligarchies are able to like, you know, maintain and control echo chambers, and that's certainly happened here.
Hmm. What's something you want to leave us with in terms of especially any lessons of resistance from El Salvador?
I think that resistance is happening even if we don't see it. And the fact of the matter is that like everybody who's joining here is joining with a desire, many of you are joining with a desire to understand this this new kind of dynamic that's emerging in our society, this new kind of set of people who are getting to dictate the political life, the economic life, the social life of our society. And there are ways that we can resist, and resistance is happening now. And I draw a lot of inspiration um, in recent weeks of what I've seen happening with federal workers, many of whom like have never participated in an action are participating in direct actions now. Many of them are seeking ways to get more organized. The ranks of like unionized labor inside of the federal government are growing. And those are efforts that we need to support and that we need to stay in relationship to. Um, I think El Salvador taught me that it may take a while to undermine the power of an oligarchy, but it is not impossible. Not even when an oligarchy kills 4% of your population can it completely kill out resistance. And so that's, I think, the other thing I'm taking from this is that this is a moment where we do get to make a choice to stand up, to fight, and that regardless of like the waves of harm that may come as a result of this tech broligarchy, that we are resilient, that the spirit of like fighting and organizing is a resilient thing. And there is power to be built in this moment, even when it feels the bleakest. So that's what El Salvador has taught me. There's this kind of interesting thing they say of Salvadorians that like you're born half dead. And I'll tell you that like my experience in my life has taught me that the complete opposite. Salvadorians are a very resilient people who have a lot of life in them. And, I learned that lesson the strongest from my own mother and the trials and tribulations she made, the trials and tribulations she went through, everything she sacrificed to get me to the place that I was. So I think about her. I think about many of the nameless people that I'll never know that stood up to an oligarchy. And I'll think today about the federal workers that are waking up this morning and choosing to do things to resist the incoming agenda of this administration and of people like Elon Musk. And that's where I choose to draw, my hope and inspiration from.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Really appreciate you bringing this long game perspective, and placing ourselves in a broader historical context that we can learn from. This is a good segue for us to talk about what the tech oligarchy means for our communities. So we're going to shift into talking about community impact and what we can do to fight back.
Right. Because this isn't just about billionaires getting richer, right? Like the Broligarchy is accomplishing their goals by helping Donald Trump advance his goals. And we're seeing that every day. Dulani, what's something you've seen this administration do that's being aided by the tech Broligarchy?
Yeah, like we've mentioned a little bit thus far, I'm really noticing how social media platforms are being used in this moment. First, to distract us, and second, to legitimize and normalize all the chaotic things that Trump and Musk are doing. Whether we're talking about Zuckerberg eliminating fact checking on the Meta platform, or Google renaming the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America on Google Maps, or Musk using X to spread a lot of disinfo about FEMA or USAID grants or whatever else. Um, all of that is real, and has an impact, especially on marginalized communities. And the focus of that ignores a lot. It hides that Trump and Elon now have access to all financial transaction data of the federal government. Our student loan data, our social security numbers, and knowing the business interests of the oligarchy, that they've made their wealth through data, for them to have access to this data is even more concerning. So that's what I'm seeing. What about you, Ramsha?
Yeah, I connect with everything that you just said. I think where I live, I've seen unmarked cars with sirens going through various neighborhoods. Specifically, ICE enforcement raids are happening across the country, where they're going after migrants. And they have the data tools provided by these companies like Palantir, provided by these tech billionaires who are creating that infrastructure for social control. And they have that data from ankle monitors from companies like BI who are helping ICE know where to go looking. Many of the arrests that took place the first weekend of the administration were of migrants who had ankle monitors on. So I've felt it in a very real way. Like when I see cops in my community, I see how tech is enabling Trump's mass deportations. And I also know about it because of amazing partners that MediaJustice has, like Mi Gente and Just Futures Law and Surveillance Resistance Lab, who have been exposing tech's relationship with immigration enforcement for a really long time. We're going to talk about tech and immigration in a future webinar, but that's what I've been noticing so far.
Yeah, absolutely. That is real. I've also been noticing, like Stephen mentioned, the mass layoffs that are happening right now inside the federal government. And we are actually going to go into depth in the next webinar around this. But it's significant to mention now because there are workers who are resisting this purge. And today was a major national day of action at federal buildings and Tesla dealerships. And so these are workers who are speaking out because they know the consequences for everyday people who depend on their services for healthcare, for social security benefits, for education. Um, yeah, would love to hear from folks who are tuning in. How are you seeing tech corporations affect your community? Please share in the chat wherever you're tuning in from.
All right. So let's take a moment to recap 3 lessons from today. Oligarchies are the rule of a wealthy few over the many. Their wealth is their source of political power, and their primary objective is to preserve their wealth. Oligarchies establish themselves through 3 methods of social control, and I think Stephen really dived into those. They control the economy. In El Salvador, it was land and agriculture. In today's world, it's data and infrastructure. They also control politics through political contributions and alliances with the infrastructure. And they implement mechanisms of social control through controlling media narratives and communications platforms. For instance, Jeff Bezos owning major newspapers like the Washington Post. Lastly, we learned that there are 14 people who make up the Tech Broligarchy. They cover many industries from defense tech to finance tech, AI, social media, crypto, the list goes on. But they are the heads of actual tech companies, while many of them are also investors.
Right. So we are getting towards the end, and we want to preview what we've got coming up. Over the next few weeks, we're going to be diving deep into the TikTok ban and tech nationalism, artificial intelligence and the looming AI wars, data centers and its impact to the climate, how communities are fighting back.
Right. And we're not just here to analyze, we're also here to act. So here's some calls to action of what you can do right now. At MediaJustice, we're leaving X, and you can follow us on other platforms at MediaJustice or at mediajustice.bsky.social on Blue Sky. More actions include following the Federal Unionist Network at Fed Workers United, who are organizing more actions in solidarity with federal workers who are being laid off and retaliated against by the Trump administration. Another call to action is to share what you've learned today with someone else. Whether it's at your dinner table or with a colleague, we encourage you to share what you learned here today to spark conversation. And you can also join us again here next Wednesday, or the following Wednesday after next Wednesday, March 5th, for our next installment of WTF. Our topic next time is going to be WTF is the Tech Broligarchy up to? And lastly, if you're tuning in on social media or YouTube, you can use the QR code on your screen to get details on our bi-weekly series directly to your inbox. You can also keep up with MediaJustice's work by signing up for updates on our website at mediajustice.org.
Awesome. And before we go, we'd love to hear from folks wherever you're tuning in from. Drop a comment on what surprised you most from today's discussion. What topics do you want us to dig into deeper? And how will you use what you learned? Thank you all again for joining Media Justice in the first installment of WTF, The Rise of the Tech Broligarchy. On behalf of Rumsha and myself, thank you for joining us.